The news today, it's now being reported that the National Planning Commission has found that government has simply failed to deal with the problems that were identified when the National Development Plan was first adopted back in 2012, 11 years ago. The Commission, in fact, says government is going in the wrong direction and that there is policy incoherence. Dr. Peter Jacobs is the strategic lead in the Equitable Education Economies Research Division at the HSRC. Dr. Jacobs, good evening to you, and thank you very much indeed for your time. In 2012, delegates at the ANC's Mangaung conference almost all stood up and said they would support the National Development Plan. The leader of the ANC at the time was the President, Jacob Zuma. He said that the government would implement the National Development Plan, and yet on almost every single metric, we've gone backwards since then. What went wrong?
Thank you very much for inviting us, Stephen. Where do you want me to start? It's very, very difficult because there has been quite a few events happening over the last few days on the 2030 National Development Plan, a little bit of stock taking, 10 years review that came out, and now preparations for the 2030 next year of democracy, and then that will coincide again with another review of the plan to track how far we've gone. In the plan itself, I think the lead up to 2012, several things happened. There were 2 or 3 efforts to develop the plan. The first phase was, as we recall, a very deep dive into the status of socioeconomic development and indicators for South Africa through what was then at that time referred to as a diagnostic review. The HSRC was central in that diagnostic review, and it brought together some of the best brains and best minds inside the country and our supporters from other parts of the world to put together this diagnostic review. Out of the diagnostic review emerged the first draft, first version of the plan, and thereafter another version of the plan that became the final version. Very, very thick document, I think in the order of 400 pages, not easy to read. But it anchored itself around 3 or 4 main chapters, and chapter 3 is, I think, the central chapter that one should study with great care, because if we reflect today on it, everything hinged on chapter 3. Why chapter 3? Because chapter 3 incorporated at the time the tension between what some in the union movement specifically referred to as the National Development Plan and the New Growth Path that came, a year or so before. And in chapter 3, you basically find the focus on employment indicators and growth indicators. And just to give you a sense of what was said back then in the plan, we were hoping that by 2020, unemployment would be well below 20%. In fact, I think there is the specific target for the unemployment rate was 14% by 2020, right? Now, today, to be realistic, we have to factor in the unforeseen COVID-19 period. But by that time, in 2019, the unemployment rate was already nearing 30%. That was before COVID came in. COVID worsened the situation, and today we're sitting with an unemployment rate that is very, very high. Now, can this be explained merely by means of the growth rate that has also been very sluggish over the time period? Or what is able to explain this? That's the first one. The second one is, I think there was a very heavy emphasis on infrastructure development and green growth at the time. Now, the extent to which we have been able to transition on green growth, everybody knows that we have not succeeded in doing that, and the energy problems and energy transition that was actually in chapter 1 of the old program or plan emphasized the urgency of climate change and the energy transition. Infrastructural development has also lagged behind, even though we have been able to establish a presidential infrastructure committee. So on the core indicators, the core chapters, I think we've got a lot of thinking to do. In the 10-year review that just came out, we've gotten an emphasis on these 4 or 5 main priorities at the moment, but still what it is lacking, it's not what we have to do and why we have to do it, but how are we going to get it done? And I think this is where we are a bit stuck. Having a National Planning Commission, it's fine, but having a planning commission in addition to a whole host of other agencies that is advising government, I think that is where problems begin. It can broadly be termed as institutional distrust or mistrust.
Sure.
So you have a planning commission, but you don't draw on them. You rather draw on the Presidential Advisory Commission.
So, Dr. Jacobs, is it fair to ask, despite what was publicly stated in 2012, was there ever really a political commitment to the plan? And then that leads to the question is, I don't know if there's a political commitment to real change now, and I hate to say it, but we've had so many promises of change that I think no matter what a politician says about change now, people have become very cynical. So is there any kind of political commitment to the National Development Plan and the National Development Commission and its recommendations now?
Well, I think, Stephen, you've got it close to the mark there, that there appears to be very, very little commitment. But I think that probably is a little bit unfair. There is a political commitment, but the political commitment is not going far enough. At this stage, I think the political commitment is centered around stability or stabilizing the ship, as it were. We've got a country that is really going through a very, very difficult moment. There's tremendous amount of social instability. There is a tremendous amount of political instability. There is a tremendous amount of economic instability. And if you throw all that together in the so-called perfect storm, the kind of polycrisis idea that is now very prominent in global debates, then you are having a very, very difficult situation. So stability, I think, is the primary driving force in commitment at the moment. Realizing the goals and the objectives of the plan, they would require much more. And one of the critical things that I think that we overlooked at the time, and is still being overlooked, is in South Africa a fairly perfunctory and very limited attention to what is referred to as citizen empowerment or empowered participation by the citizenry. And how we're going to address that, I think, is going to be critical in both rethinking the priorities, rethinking in what we need, a new plan, what we're going to do in the lead up to 2030. In fact, we are at the moment where we have to begin to think of a new plan, as it were, and a new way of realizing those kinds of objectives. Even when it comes to commitment, if we have a greater gap between what politicians are saying and what the citizens want, you are obviously heading toward confrontation, a very serious standoff. We have seen some of these over the last few years, not only during the COVID period, but even beyond. And that kind of instability may result in outcomes of state and state management, state organization that are really very hard to predict at this particular point.
Dr. Peter Jacobs, thank you. Strategic Lead in the Equitable Education and Economies Research Division at the HSRC. Really appreciate the time.